The National Center for the Study of Civil Rights and African American Culture at Alabama State University, through the Voting Rights Research Repository Project, is sponsoring a 3-panel series entitled Civic Engagement in the COVID Era and Beyond. During these discussions, our guests will express a number of opinions that do not necessarily reflect those of the National Center or Alabama State University. However, we are happy to invite a vigorous dialogue of diverse opinions among our panelists and hope that these conversations inspire our audience to engage critical civic issues facing our state and our nation. Hello, I'm Dr. Howard Robinson, Alabama State University archivist and historian. Today, we have assembled a particularly influential and informative list of guests in part 1 of our 3-part series, Civic Engagement in the COVID Era and Beyond. To set the stage, we have longtime politician and political strategist, Dr. Joe Reed, who will place the 2020 election into a historical context. After Dr. Reed's comments, we'll have a 3-member panel that will examine the different aspects of the upcoming election. Thad McClammy, Alabama House of Representative member, will look at how the election will impact the future of education with a particular focus on public school funding in Montgomery. Our next panelist, Akeisha Anderson, Policy Director for the Alabama Appleseed Center for Law and Justice, will address ideas around criminal justice reform with a focus on prison overcrowding. And finally, Dr. Reed will join the panel and help us discuss the importance of down ballot races. We will start with Dr. Joe Reed, who will lay the foundation for today's discussion, 2020 election and why it's important, by examining the potential implications for the 2020 November elections. Dr. Joe Reed Sr. is chairperson of the Alabama Democratic Conference, vice chair of Minority Affairs for the Alabama Democratic Party, former Montgomery City Council member, former chair of the Board of Trustees for Alabama State University, and he was the president of the Alabama State Teachers Association prior to its merger with the Alabama Education Association in 1969. Dr. Reed, during a political career spanning some 60 years, you have experienced 15 presidential elections, from John F. Kennedy's narrow 1960 win to Ronald Reagan's landslide victory in 1980. You witnessed the law and order presidency of Richard Nixon, the father and son elections of George Herbert Walker Bush and George Walker Bush. You have also witnessed the election of Barack Obama as the nation's first African-American president. Each of these elections have revolved around unique issues particular to that time period. Today, we're asking you to share your thoughts on the most significant ramifications for this November's 2020 election. Dr. Reed.
First, let me thank you for inviting me. I appreciate this opportunity to share this program with Representative McClammy. I was trying to see if I saw him on here, but I don't see him. So wiggle or something so I can see which one.
He's in the middle. He's here.
He's in the middle.
Yes.
Mike, how you doing?
Hey, present.
Okay, well, we're still here. That's good. I don't want to listen. I want to speak to you. In the meantime, I want to speak to all the program participants. You know, one of the most important things about America is the right to vote. And I say that because I always call that the right to vote the sacred pearl of democracy. That where the people have a chance to choose their leaders, and elections have consequences. This election is very important because of a lot of reasons. And I've been around for a little while now. And every election, they say this is the most important election. Well, I can tell you, based on what I know, based on what I've seen, based on my experience, this is the most important election since I've been around, and I'm an old man now. This election has to do a lot with the future of this country, not various policies, not various programs, but the future of the country itself. Because the President of the United States is a very powerful person. And when the Constitution was written, a lot of power was thrust in the office of the presidency to some extent because of George Washington. George Washington had a lot of influence on the presidency, and the people believed in George Washington. Now, George Washington was certainly a man who moved with a degree of caution, and he was very sensitive about history. So the president is a very powerful person. And I wrote a paper once on the American presidency. And I conclude by saying the only thing that can stop a president is his own conscience.
You can take
So
your
we're
medicine.
beginning to see a lot of that now. The election of our current president, everybody's been talking about let's get a businessman to be president. Let's run the country like a business. First of all, you can't run this country like a business, a typical private business. This country is run by the people, based on the people, and it's for the people, and the people needs. So we have a president now who has no respect and no knowledge, very little knowledge about the history of the presidency, the office of the presidency, what it should and shouldn't do, and the consequences of what the president does. We have a president now who really lacks a lot of understanding of history, lacks a lot of understanding of program. He is accustomed to, and we all are creatures of our experiences. He's accustomed to running his small private business where he was everything. He was in charge of everything. Nobody had to vote. If they did, it didn't matter. He could overrule the votes, but they didn't. So he was in charge of everything. And he wants to run this country the same way. He has this whole thing, I do you a favor, you do me one. Don't worry about the consequences. He believes in reciprocity. He believes that whatever I want to do, I can do it. And he has made a serious mistake of thinking that this country, which has a Republican form of government, where the people have the right to choose their leaders, and they do it every 4 years, where you have a Congress that can pass laws, and you got a Constitution that's already established that can limit laws. And that does limit laws, even the power of the president. Because the president doesn't have all power. But the president right now operates on a theory and practice that everybody serves him. He takes the position that he's in office to be served, not to serve. And what is happening now, and it's amazing, over the last few weeks, we've seen a lot of people come forward, including a lot of Republicans, because they see him as a threat, not to some policy, not to some minor program. They see him as a threat to democracy, as a threat to the country. And that's why so many people now are rising up, saying, look, they won in America. This man is bad news for this country. He's bad news for the republic. And we can't have him 4 more years. Could we survive 4 more years? That's an open question. I said personally that if Trump gets reelected, we may have a revolution or another civil war is a form of revolution too. And we could have that. This time it won't be over the slave, or it could be, because his position on black folks opened the question. So what we have now is an election where a president we cannot have anymore. We just cannot. the country may or may not survive. And that's why this election is important, and it's so important. Not that others have not been. And we've said that before. This is the most important election. Well, it probably was important to the guy who was running, or the lady who was running. But now, the most important election now is important because the country is at stake. Joe Biden's slogan for the soul of America. We're fighting for the soul of America. I told someone a few days ago, we're fighting to save the country. And I don't believe there's another election I know in the last 150 years been more important. I think since Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, that was a very important election because the country was about to fall apart because of the issue of slavery. And it was Lincoln who decided, well, I'm going to whoop the South and keep them in line. You can't leave this country. You're part of this country, and you can't leave it. So we had a civil war, and of course, we know the outcome. Now, since Lincoln, I don't know of another time that the election was more important. Even the election between Lincoln and McClellan in 1864, that was a very challenging election. But out of those two elections, I don't know of any other election more important than the election we have 2 weeks from now. Because the country, the future is at stake. Democracy is at stake. And really the world is at stake. Because I'm worried that if Trump gets elected, I'm not sure what would happen in those European countries that was in World War II. I don't know what would happen. Putin is upset because, well, he's upset probably about several things. But one thing he's certainly upset about, when the Soviet Union dissolved a few years back, that weakened Russia. And I wouldn't be at all surprised that Putin could not persuade or make our current president abandon many of those Eastern European countries. So not only do we have our democracy being challenged, we also have the world being challenged. So that's a big reason why this election is important. Aside from the domestic issues we have to deal with.
I would like you to look beyond the personality of the president and speak to some of the implications of a Trump administration, but particularly the other issues that are on the table for this November's 2020 election. What are the other sort of critical forks in the road for the United States, for Alabama, as we look towards this 2020 election?
Well, we have some bread and butter issues out there. We have the whole issue of education and how it's going to be funded and how that's going to be helped. That's one issue, and that's a domestic issue that we all got to be concerned about. But that issue certainly doesn't present the threat, the imminent threat to this country as some of these foreign policy issues. Then, of course, the judiciary. I've always been a champion of having a strong judiciary, but having a fair judiciary. And it's kind of people that our current president put on the bench. 1/3 of the current Supreme Court now put on the bench by our current president. 1/3. And between now and the next 4 years, somebody else may vacate a seat. That's another problem. The problem of him wanting to put all the people who disagree with him. Want to put them in jail. Want to start locking up folks. The fact that he will not really denounce white supremacy, well, he's done it reluctantly and slowly and vaguely to some extent. It wasn't clear and convincing. He said it only because I think because the public criticized him for not doing it earlier. Then, of course, our civil rights, black folk, and I can't see how any black person could be for our current president being reelected. And I said, any black person, I mean, I'm frightened that you got even one person who wants to be for him. And yet, he's going to run a tight race. He's going to run a very, very tight race. So that's another matter we have to worry about. How are we going to be treated? So we got education, and we got this whole issue of healthcare. Healthcare. We all on this panel probably got avenues to get proper medical care. But when I go to the pharmacist, have to do a copay, sometimes a pretty high copay too, very high. I said, good gracious, like me, things have gone up since last week. That's what I tell the pharmacist. But then when I walk away, well, what about the poor little guy who can't even come to the pharmacist? What about the poor little lady who cannot visit a drugstore? One who cannot get their prescription filled? So this whole issue of Medicare, this whole issue of health care, the Obama care, Trump on one hand tell everybody, I'm going to provide you with the appropriate health care. And in the same breath, he's telling his lawyers, y'all go to the Supreme Court, let's get it declared unconstitutional. He's the only man I know with a ready-made law on his lip for every occasion. And he has one. And he has no problem. He doesn't stumble. He just says and keep going. Those are the challenges we have. What about children? What kind of example is this man setting for our children, our grandchildren? That's the big threat that I see domestically in this country. We got the whole question of our infrastructure. It's in bad shape. It's in terrible shape. But that doesn't bother him. So we have internal problems that will affect us, and the external problems that would have an impact on us. The world is small. You could take this program you and I are on now, and I guess, 30 seconds or less, you can flash it all over the world. The world is very small. And yet, we have a president who sees all this disease, this coronavirus. I mean, it's lethal. It's deadly. He's not setting an example. He said it one, but it's a poor example. And we got all these people who have died daily, like 1,000 a day. And he said, well, we've turned the corner to death. The corner to death. So these are the things that I see why this election is so important. Students in the various colleges and universities need and should have more financial support and help in getting through school. We have to have somebody who's sympathetic, who's concerned about student welfare, who's concerned about having good classrooms, who's concerned about the average working person as opposed to the millionaires or billionaires that come across and confront him from day to day. Some are probably his friends. So that's what I see as the
Okay.
big challenge. We
And,
got reapportionment coming up very soon. We got to have a Justice Department that's sympathetic and will help us when we draw the reapportionment lines uh, in the next year.
one of the things
Go
one of
on.
the things I want to transition to at this point is a broader discussion and inviting our other panelists. So we're going to invite our two other panelists. That includes State Representative for House Seat 76, Thad McClammy. He is the chair of Public Safety Committee, chair of the Black Belt Infrastructure Committee. He's a member of the Montgomery Democratic Conference, former president of Trenton State College from 1981 to 1995. Then we also have policy director of the Alabama Appleseed Center for Law and Justice, Akeisha Anderson. She has a bachelor's degree in sociology from Alabama State University, a master's degree in public administration from AUM, Auburn University in Montgomery, and from the University of Alabama. She has a law degree and is certified in governmental affairs. She also worked with Congresswoman Terry Sewell and for the Montgomery County Commission. In addition, she was a law fellow with the Daniel H. Rainberg at the Williams Institute at UCLA Law School. So we have these two other distinguished individuals. First, we're going to turn to Representative Thad McClammy. And Thad McClammy is going to talk about this November, on this November's election, for the first time really in 30 years, Montgomery voters will determine whether or not to raise the mill rate tax, and giving Montgomery, if passed, an additional $33 million for kindergarten through 12th grade education. We'd like to Representative McClammy to discuss the implications of this tax referendum, including both opposition and support of the legislation. Representative McClammy.
Well, first of all, I'd like to express my appreciation to Dr. Reed for bringing me up to date because he is the source, and we appreciate the sacrifices and contributions that he has made, not only to this community, but to this nation. We are in a situation, as Dr. Reed said, that will be definitely the most important election that those of us that will have the opportunity to witness will ever share. The situation with our school situation is that if we don't get it done this time, I'm not sure where we would be as far as the outcome if we don't get it done. Montgomery is the capital city of the state of Alabama. And yet our school system is tied for last as far as funding. We number 125th in the funding of our school system. We're in a situation where I've heard Dr. Reed, and you probably read some of the same commentaries. We keep hearing these things about what the military has to have, because Montgomery has one of the most strategic settings for the military, just about as almost any other community in America. When we look at the Iowa College, when we look at the Board Officer School, et cetera, in fact, we have like 70 plus nations represented in Montgomery, Alabama, every day. They're back to land forces. And right now, this is one of the most prime pieces that's out there, and where we have a president like Dr. Reed just got to describe it. You know, even if it's staying allowed, you can't move it. So it's something that I made a conscious decision. There's a saying that says, the eagle that chases two rabbits shall eat neither. So I sort of decided on this election that we're going to chase one rabbit, and I would try to do whatever was in my power to help get this village, education village, enacted. Because if we don't get it done now, I hate to imagine what we're going to be facing as we go forward. There's a situation where the history of a government school system has been one that's not the greatest in the world. For a number of years, this city was the most probably segregated city, or one of the ones in the state of Alabama. And for a number of years, that everything was a private school almost. I saw an article that I think it's probably the current CEO of the Montgomery Academy here in Montgomery. And this person was talking about how the community has been compromised by the fact that we had two school systems that's never, I mean, you had to more than what's building, but at the same time, until recently, we have had very much what you call integration in the community. And it is something at this time, as I've told everybody, that when you look at the talent of our young people, in fact, when you look at some of these billboards around the city, I like to take a close look at them. Because many of those billboards were designed by current students in the Montgomery Public Schools. So there's nothing wrong with the talents of our students, but we can't expect them to compete with about 30% or whatever of the competition. And this is something that I would hope that we can get it done. And it's something that, and like I said, Joe, I'm just chasing one rabbit in this race. And we're going to try to continue to do what we can, and we hope that the community will stand up and take a position for our children. Because if we don't do it, I can assure you that, we got a new school system in Montgomery County. That's Pike Road. Pike Road, I think, got something like 30 plus bills. And they've only been, I think the city has only existed since 1995, I believe, related to that. But anyway, it had even been a city for a few years. But at this time, they had come up with a scheme for that. At one time, the metro government was a hot item. And but now it's a situation that you come up with a scheme that you could achieve the same thing with Pike Road. And until Montgomery Public Schools can break itself to be competitive, I'm almost sure that we're going to have some very dark days education-wise in this community.
Okay. We may touch on that in addition as the program rolls out, but I'd like now to turn our attention to Makisha Anderson. And Nakisha, we know the Alabama legislature was cut short this year. Moreover, the Department of Justice has issued a report declaring Alabama's entire men's prison system unconstitutional. In that light, what are some of the criminal justice issues that people should be aware of as we move into 2021?
Yeah, so first off, I want to thank you, Dr. Robinson, for having me here today. I'm thrilled and honored to be here to talk to my alma mater. I'm also happy to be on a panel next to Dr. Reed and Dr. McClammy, so thank you for that. So many Alabamians may be aware, but I'm afraid that not enough Alabamians are aware, but the governor of Alabama is currently in the process of rolling out a plan to build 3 new mega prisons within the state of Alabama, which is her solution to our prison overcrowding problem, our prison crisis. This past year, the legislature did have a number of bills that were designed to address some of the criminal justice reforms that the state of Alabama needs. However, there were also additional bills that, we hoped would have been presented this year, that we hope are presented next year. But just going back to the DOJ reports that you just referenced, I kind of just want to break down what exactly the DOJ found. So there wasn't just one DOJ report, but there were two DOJ reports. So in 2016, the Department of Justice, this is under the Trump administration, and in 2016, this was actually under Jeff Sessions, so an Alabama native. His DOJ began investigating Alabama's prisons. And the first report that was issued came out about a year and a half ago. And that report found that our prisons were unconstitutional for several reasons. So overcrowding was a piece of it, but that was not all of it. The DOJ report also found that there was a culture of corruption within the Alabama Department of Corrections, that our prisons were overflooded with drugs and contraband, and that people that were incarcerated in Alabama had significantly high mental health and substance abuse rates, and also that there were more homicides and suicides that took place in our prisons than other prisons throughout the country. So just in and of itself, that is alarming. And those are not issues that can be solved solely by building new prisons. Most recently, July of this year, so this is now under Attorney General Barr, a second DOJ report came out that kind of doubled down on some of the initial findings, but found that, again, our prisons are unconstitutional. But this time the report focused on excessive force. So in the middle of what we are witnessing, so a national outcry about police brutality, people talking about Black Lives Matter and that movement taking off, what we are simultaneously seeing is that in Alabama, we have correction officers, so these are also police officers just in our prisons, that have been found to be using excessive force against people that are incarcerated. And so that is what our DOJ reports found. Again, as a solution to these two DOJ reports, Alabama, our governor, without legislative approval or legislative input, is deciding to build 3 new prisons, which will cost the state about $88 million a year. So that is the cap. So approximately $88 million a year over the span of 30 years. So about $2.6 billion. And so what is really interesting about this is that the state of Alabama currently, without new prisons, we already spend about a quarter of our general fund budget on the Alabama Department of Corrections. Over the last 10 years, we have seen the budget for the Alabama Department of Corrections just explode. And so Dr. McClammy and Dr. Reed both talked about, issues that are really impacting our communities in education. When we think about education, granted, the education fund and the general fund is different, but just kind of as an example, over the last 10 years, the amount of money that the state of Alabama has spent on K-12 education has increased by about 33%. Over that same period of time, the amount of money that we have spent on the Alabama Department of Corrections has increased by 96%. So it has nearly doubled. And so what that indicates is that throwing more money at the Department of Corrections in and of itself is not going to fix these problems that we have within the Department of Corrections. And so building new prisons seems to be just more of the same. And so what I would hope that we invest in instead, in some of the changes that we do see legislatively that I hope are able to be introduced and passed next year, do include things like funding mental health and substance abuse treatment. So studies have found that somewhere between 50 to 90% of the people incarcerated in Alabama's prisons have a mental health or substance abuse problem. And what's really starking about that, or really sad about that, is that many people in our prison that have a drug dependency issue now did not enter prison with a drug dependency issue. So these are issues that are created merely by being within our prisons. Also, the DOJ reports talked a lot about the culture of corruption and these things that our prison guards are doing wrong. There was a bill last legislative session that hopefully will come back next legislative session that was designed to increase some oversight of the Alabama Department of Corrections. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me to know that there is a national attorney general's office that says that our prisons are doing things wrong, that essentially the way that we treat people that are accused of committing crimes is illegal. So we are breaking the law in the way that we treat people who have broken the law. And instead of addressing just, what our leadership and what the people who are entrusted with taking care of people in prison, what they are doing wrong, we're just throwing more money at them. So hopefully there is some oversight bill that comes up. Also, in order to deal with the overcrowding issue, it's not enough just to build new prisons. The DOJ report said it itself that, building new prisons is not going to solve our problems. We actually need to talk about some other solutions that will, one, keep people out of prison, where that means keeping people out on the front end. So seriously investing in pretrial diversion programs, making sure that they are uniform and not just a pay-to-play system in the state of Alabama, but making sure that we have alternatives to people even going into prison, but also working with some resentencing legislation will be helpful as well. In 2013, there was some great resentencing legislation that was passed, but it was not retroactive. So that means that someone could be sentenced today for a shorter period of time than someone that was sentenced for the same crime, 50 years ago, and somebody, who is in prison now for a crime that, they have spent years in prison for. If they were to be convicted today, they probably would not spend the same amount of time there. So resentencing, making that retroactive, but also really thinking about some of these laws from the 1990s era, tough on crime, war on drugs era, such as our 3 strikes law, that is putting people in prison for just ridiculously long periods of time that just does not make sense. It does not help us in terms of public safety to keep people, 65, 70, 80 in jail for, something very minor, 20, 50 years ago. So we really need to start thinking about who we have in jail currently, why we're putting people in prison, and how we can kind of reduce that.
One of the things that your conversation makes me think about, and I think also Representative Clammy talked about this, and that is to some of what today's Black Lives Matter and funding the police initiative call for is a rethinking how you allocate monies in a society. So anybody's budget, you look at their budget, you can see what the important issues are and the priorities in their lives or in their communities are. Mm-hmm. And so for such a large part of the Alabama budget to be allocated towards the criminal justice system and penal system is problematic. And so this movement, part of it is calling for that money to be redirected from either the police department or the corrections system and to the types of programming that keep people out of jail or out of that system in the first place. And of course, that we have an opportunity this November to make one such investment in terms of the mill rate in Montgomery. And so these are the types of real world decisions that we have to make in order to stem the tide and the growth of the penal system at the back end. Could you talk a little bit about some of the initiatives that might be implemented and money could be allocated that would negate the need for a growing prison system?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that when we talk about, reallocating budgets, it is really important to highlight that Alabama is a poor state. So every decision that we make about how we are going to spend a penny a dime matters, because we do not have the same luxury as a state of California that, may have a lot more money in their budget to kind of play around with. We have to be really intentional about how we spend every penny because it makes a difference. And so I referenced that 25% of our 2020 budget goes to the Alabama Department of Corrections. I also referenced that about 50 to 90% of people in prison currently have either a mental health or substance dependency issue. But only 3% of our budget, 3% of our budget currently goes to the Department of Public Health. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and only about 6% of our budget goes to the Department of Mental Health, which is the agency that would be tasked with, providing mental health as well as substance abuse programming. So that is one immediate area where, investing more money could likely make a huge difference. It does not make a lot of sense to me that we treat things like mental health and drug dependency as a criminal justice issue, when that, in all honesty, I think should be treated as a public health issue. We should not be arresting people and sending them to prison because, of these things that really require treatment, instead of requiring them to be locked up. So that's one immediate area where we can spend money. Programming.
I would like. I'm going to let you get back to that, but I would like to bring Thad McClammy back into the conversation and ask him, because he sits on both sides of this. He is in the legislature and making decisions about spending, although in the minority, but he's also advocating and pushing for more funds, particularly in this upcoming election with the decision about the mill rates in Montgomery. Could you talk a little bit about this tension between the expenditure of monies in the criminal justice system as opposed to the front end types of activities, including education and community, health department and other activities that would avert people from the criminal justice system?
Well, first of all, we have to look at what we now have and what we was compared to the past. Right now, the criminal justice system is a very large business. When you look at one item, when you look at healthcare for the penal system, and it's something that it's really mind-boggling. I've seen the system emerge from 4,000 students, 4,000 inmates to what we have today, which is many, many times 4,000. So when I was a student, I worked full time with the youth facility and did about a year or two, been working with the Alabama Department of Corrections. And at that time, I was a part of the Alabama Department of Corrections. We decided to say, well, there's only so much you can get done in 6 different life years. So the one thing that we created that still prevails, and that's what you call the work release program. This is where you can actually get a person get a job under work release, do a good job using it. This is one of the best programs that I was ever a part of. Probably say one, because right now it's not about rehabilitation. It's about one thing. It's about business. Corrections Systems of America. It's a Fortune 500 company. It's next door in Tennessee, and so that's what we're dealing with. And with a president like we have now, everything in his mind is privatization. And basically that's what these 3 mega prisons are about. That's a lot of money every year that's going out of. And it's something that until the community rises up and says, well, this is enough, and we're going to take more interest in what's going on with it, we're going to continue to have it. And but as far as the question of the village with the Montgomery public school system, that's something that we cannot afford to lose, because if we lose that, it's a lot more on the line than we see an increase in the village.
I want to follow up this line of thought with an inquiry to Dr. Reed. Dr. Reed, so we talked about, and you outlined a number of areas where this election will be consequential. We've talked a little bit about the level of incarceration in the state of Alabama and the money allocated to that. We talked about the education in Montgomery and the ballot referendum, looking to address some of the funding issues in local education. But there are, in addition to the presidential election, there are a number of down ballot elections, both at the federal level and at the state level, and even the county and city level, that are going to also speak to some of these issues, some of the issues that you outlined. Could you talk about some of those critical races and the critical positions, and how this election may be consequential for some of these issues in terms of education, in terms of the criminal justice system, in terms of the other issues that face us?
Yes. One of the first down ballot position we have is, of course, the United States Senator. That's Senator Doug Jones, who is running for re-election against another fellow. And of course, that's very important. I see that elections is important in two different ways. One way is that the outcome of this seat, if we win it, could be the difference as to who leads the Senate between the senator from Kentucky or Senator Chuck Schumer from New York. If the Democrats get a majority in the United States Senate, Chuck Schumer would be the Democratic leader for the country, at least for the next 2 years, maybe for the next 5, maybe 10. The leader, the majority leader in the Democrat and in the Senate, whoever he may be, whether Republican or Democrat, controls the flow of legislation. To give you an example, Obama, when President Obama was president, Mitch McConnell decided he was just not going to clear any of his judges. I'm not thinking about the Supreme Court judge, but good gracious, a lot of other judges at the district court level, where most people go in the federal court, go to the district court. And then there's the Court of Appeals. And then the Supreme Court. That's an enormous amount. But that's controlled by who gets through. It's controlled by Mitch McConnell, because he has a majority of Republicans in the Senate. Now, if they're not in the Senate, if we're in the Senate, we Democrats, then that's a different ball game. So that's what a down ballot issue could be. Then we go a step further down. We come down to a congressman. That's the same thing as to who's going to be Speaker of the House. Right now, Congresswoman Pelosi is the Speaker of the House because we got a majority of Democrats in the House. But that's down ballot. Then once you leave the federal level, you have these county commission districts. We don't have legislative districts up right now in this general election because they'll be elected when the governor is elected 2 years from now. But right now we got county commissioners, school board members being elected, and various ones being elected, and it has a lot to do with it, the down ballot issue. So that's one reason the Alabama Democratic Conference just went on record and voted a straight Democratic ticket. We said one dot does it all. Make one dot by that.
Okay.
Then you get every Democrat you want. And of course, you vote Republican, you make one dot by the elephant, and you get it. So these down ballot issues are very important because each one of these issues was created and enacted for something. Just always remember, those positions are there for something. They're not there for nothing. They're there to do something. And whatever they do is going to affect you. It's going to affect some of us. And that's the way that is. So the down ballot issues and the Montgomery tax issue, Reverend, can't be emphasized enough. Now, there are a lot of statewide amendments on that. But the most important amendment to us has to be the Montgomery tax referendum. As Representative McClammon said, the last one was 30 years ago. Yeah. And we can't fail this time around. We can't fail.
And
Our city depends on it.
Akeisha Anderson, I promised to get back to you. We derailed your conversation to some degree. I wanted to have a few other voices chime in, but I want to get back to some of the ways that you see from that legislatively, and actually that people could have a voice in the system, not only by voting, but by communicating to their respective representatives, by attending city council or county commission, but also by reaching out to their state legislators. But what other approaches do you think we need to look towards and push for to address some of the ills of our criminal justice system as we move into the next year?
Yeah, so I think I went over a lot of them. So funding mental health and substance abuse, or substance dependency treatment. I discussed some sort of accountability for our Alabama Department of Corrections, pretrial diversion. I mentioned that already, but a few other ones that I did not mention. Another reason why our prisons are overcrowded, or something that does not help with our overcrowding issue, at least, is the fact that our Department of Pardons and Paroles has significantly decreased the number of people that they are letting out via pardon and parole currently. And so that backlog that we currently have with BPP, as well as their decrease in number of people that they are even doing hearings for, as well as letting people out, that definitely does not help any with regard to relieving the overcrowding within our prisons. I also would love to see some sort of legislation that I mentioned this shortly a little while ago that addresses our 3 strikes law. So either repealing or reforming that, but also some sort of legislation that just addresses our state's drug policies would be really nice to see as well. So as we are seeing other states legalize marijuana, whether for medical purposes or just recreational purposes, Alabama is definitely on the opposite end of the spectrum. We spend about $22 million a year prosecuting petty drug offenses, and that is just not a good use of taxpayer money, especially not, again, when Alabama is a poor state. There are other issues that we could adequately fund. So just even changing some of our drug policies and the way that we treat drug crimes would probably be really useful here in the state.
Representative McClammy, are there any of those issues that Akeisha addressed? Are any of them? Is there a legislative agenda that includes any of those types of issues, or is the disposition of the state legislature in opposition to the approaches that she outlined?
Well, I think the one that probably that has been enacted that will have the most impact as we go forward. I think a lot of people pay a lot of attention to it. I was with the legislature. There were 700 plus offenses that were classified as crimes of moral turpitude. Over 10 years or so, we got it down to 300. As I speak today, the crimes of moral turpitude have been reduced from 700 and something down to less than 40. Now, what that means is that when we have persons that have been released, or persons that are in the process of being released, if they fall in that category, that they of a crime that's not a crime of moral turpitude, they could actually be restored their voting rights, and a decision must be made in 45 days. So that's something that a lot of people, we spend a lot of time trying to get information out there, and we continue to do it because we literally have hundreds of people out there that have even completed the sentences. They're on parole, or they're on probation, or they're on suspended sentences. So that's one of the bright spots. Because it took a long time to get it done. In fact, Joe had kind of a unusual situation with former Governor Sigmund. He had got out a few years ago, and his son was running for Attorney General. And so I went to him. I said, Governor, look, you need to go ahead and get your voters' rights reestablished. He said, well, I have a federal case. I said, but the state has the federal cases. But anyway, long story short, we got, I think, a day or so before the election. We did get his voters' rights reestablished. And I tell him all the time that once he gets with another stuff behind us, he's going to need to be the spokesperson for what the impact of that piece of legislation is given. So I think I'm sure Absentee had a great part in the play with it because our Secretary of State was the one that came up with the package. I had the package. He came out and said, look, give it to him. If he don't get it passed, I don't worry about my name. And so that's probably the brightest step that really I've seen over there, the piece what we write about work release. Those two are the brightest spots I've seen in the Department of Corrections. I've seen it from when we had a total prison population, state of Alabama, like 4,000.
I do want to ask, Keisha, you might be able to address this. Taking into account that there's a backlog in parts of paroles, and then having that backlog, it sometimes means that people are stay in prison longer than they have to. Which to address, it seems like you need more funds. But then that's speaking to that same issue of funneling more money into this system. How do you make sense of those two issues?
Well, the Bureau of Pardons and Paroles is actually a bit unique. And they are unique in the sense that they are actually an agency where we have seen an increase in funding over the past few years. But what is also unique about Bureau of Pardons and Paroles, a couple of years ago, there was some legislative reform where the governor now has the ability to appoint the head of Bureau of Pardons and Paroles. So the current head of Bureau of Pardons and Paroles, Charlie Graddick, has been there for about a year or two now. But Charlie Graddick is a former state attorney general, and he is someone who, in my personal estimation, so not speaking on behalf of my agency, but really believes in these outdated tough on crime policies. And so, as you probably know, we all work somewhere, and as we know, the head of a agency or department, that kind of trickles down to the agency and what decisions are made, and impacts everything else. And so Bureau of Pardons and Paroles is a bit unique in the sense that their funding has actually increased over the past few years, but this whole keeping people in or not letting people out on pardons and paroles does not seem necessarily to be attached to, funding issues. What I will say in defense of Bureau of Pardons and Paroles is that it is important when you let people out of prison to make sure that there are mechanisms in place for the people to be properly supervised, for them to have a probation or parole officer that actually is checking in on them, etc. And there are stories of the Bureau of Pardons and Paroles not necessarily having that in place in the past. And so there may be some issues in terms of staffing and getting the people to actually do supervision. But I'm not quite sure that funding is the issue for Bureau of Pardons and Paroles. I think that it could in part be attributable to the fact that, this is an agency where now the agency belief is that people actually belong in prison, and that, Charlie Graddick has been very open in saying it is not his job to deal with the overcrowding problem in prison. That's not his issue. So I think that there's something a bit different happening over there.
And again, one of the issues, Representative McClammy, one of the issues I think that in directions that I think the state should consider, and that is investing in the types of institutions that provide opportunities that divert people from the types of activities that ensure that they are installed in the criminal justice system. So again, with the funding that the Montgomery school system is asking for, what are the intended outcomes of that funding? What will be different? What will be enhanced, by having by increasing this mill rate and having this infusion of funds into the Montgomery County school system?
Well, first of all, what's Montgomery school system or any school system that's last in state funding is what we have. And what makes it so not acceptable, I mean, this is, we should be at the head rather than at the bottom. And until we send our students out there now with 10 bills of funding. We compete against this community that's only 10 to 15 years old that has 30 bills, 30 plus. And all of even some of the systems that we look out on, the black belt, a number of them have a level of funding that's greater than the rate that we have here to see that one time. And it's something that you get, there are some, in my mind, potential that we're going to be open to try to justify that we could provide the level of education, particularly for the military, because that's almost, in fact, they've taken on, I think, with the chamber, a retired one-star general. And I've been on some of these Zoom presentations, etc. We've been listening to his tone. But if you all don't get your act together, then some of this stuff could be moving out here.
Okay, I want to wrap up our conversation by giving everyone a chance to just make one last closing statement. Could we start with you, Dr. Reed, and then we'll move to Representative McClammy, and then to you, Akeisha Anderson. Dr. Reed?
Yes, I would like to say that remind voters that elections have consequences. The consequence can be good or they can be bad. It depends on who you put in office. It makes a difference as to who gets elected. Your vote counts. It can be one vote difference. One who got the highest number of votes is the one going to take the office. The one who comes in second never takes the oath. It's the one who comes in first. So going to the polls and vote on election day. This is not only this election, every other election we have. Put someone in office that's going to look out for the well-being of our country and the well-being of our people. It's so important that we elect the right folks to office. And we cannot say enough about the importance of the election. This election, as I said in the beginning, in my opinion, and I'm sure that 90% of the people in the country agrees with me, that the most important election we've ever had, I would say, since Abraham Lincoln election in 1960 and 1864. This is a serious election. Democracy is on trial. It's at stake. And if Trump gets back in, I don't know what going to happen to us.
Okay. Okay, Representative McClammy?
I agree with Dr. Reed 100% because the thing with the president, like he says, we've never been faced with an agenda from a president as with this man. I mean, I'm totally convinced, that he wants to be a dictator. And whatever is necessary, because he's got one shot at it. And at the same time, we got one shot to stop him. And one thing we had to keep in mind is that the somewhere says that a house that's in opposition to itself shall not stand. So in each election, whether up or down balance, we're going to have to come together. And otherwise, we're all going to fall together.
Okay, Akeisha?
Yeah, and I would like to stress the fact that after the elections are done, once we have people in position, that it's important for us to remember that elected officials, whether we voted for them or not, are there to represent and serve us. And so, especially as we start paying closer attention to this prison construction plan and thinking about ways that we can fight it or stop it, I think that is essential for people to make sure that their voices are heard, whether you are able to reach out to the governor's office, reach out to Department of Corrections. The people that are making this decision right now aren't necessarily your legislators, but that does not mean that your voice cannot be heard. We are seeing people throughout the state of Alabama, specifically in the communities where these prisons are slated to be built, really speaking out and are really outraged by these plans. So both in Bibb County and Elmore County, which is really nice to see. We have seen students write op-eds just from throughout the state. So to the extent that you can share with your family and your friends that, you know, this is not the way that you want your state and your leaders to spend your taxpayer dollars, that you would prefer for them to invest in other things, other programming, that matters. So I encourage people to use their voice, to share with others what's happening, find ways to speak out, whether that is calling the governor or writing op-eds in your local paper. But just know that you do have a say in this, or at least you should. And now is the time to use your voice to kind of speak up.
Thank you for our panelists, Dr. Reed, Representative Thad McClammy, Akeisha Anderson, for engaging our program. Again, the first in a series of programs that deal with the 2020. This particular one deals with the 2020 election and why is it important.